Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war with the best analysts, scholars, rabbis, journalists, practitioners from around the world. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and Emory University emeritus professor of Middle Eastern history and political science. Our previous webinars are available for your viewing. We are eager to help all of you learn more about Israel and its place in the Middle East. Hamas terrorists on October 7th killed 1,200 Israelis and others. 240 were kidnapped. It was the worst slaughter of Jews since the end of World War II and the Holocaust. And then more than half a year later, on the evening of April 13-14, Israel sustained a massive military attack from 300 drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles tossed at it from Iran or Iranian proxies. Only a multinational defense of intelligence sharing, aircraft, ships, and anti-missile systems prevented a catastrophe. Had some of those missiles hit civilian and infrastructure targets, the Hamas-Israel war today would look a lot different. We didn't have a full-fledged conflict evolve from Iran's attack. On April 19th, when Israel responded with a moderate response, the Iranians didn't respond to the Israeli response. Jerusalem let the world know that it had the ability to reach into Iran, perhaps even with impunity, but it did not attack strategic assets, at least not ones that we know of. And the war goes on, and Iran's actions have influence upon the region at large and Israel's well-being today as well as tomorrow. Events didn't stop there in April. We had the International Court of Justice raise their hand and say maybe some Israelis would be arrested for behavior that was contrary to international law. We had the United Nations put up their hand and say Palestine would not be recognized as a full member. And then, almost as if it was triggered by some automatic button, colleges and universities in this country exploded with anger, one right after another. If you study the Middle East long enough, you've got to be a cynic. And you want to say, wow, did one follow the other? And what is the connections? Are there any? But before we get to that speculation, let's talk with some really smart people about the broader picture of Israel and its challenges with Iran. And yes, of course, we can refer to Hezbollah in Lebanon, another ally proxy of Tehran. I welcome previous guests, Dr. Meir Litvak, Dr. Matthew Levitt, Dr. Eran Lerman, individuals who have followed Iran and Iranian foreign policy for their entire careers. How do you put the events of April into the context of October 7th? Meir, let me begin with you. When we met in January, you offered the idea 3 months into this war that this really was the first phase of an Iranian-Israeli war, that it wasn't just Hamas and Israel that were going at each other. And you put this into a perspective which was really intriguing to me at the time because I'd never thought of it that way.
Let me say that the conflict now in Gaza is the culmination of a long war of attrition which Iran has been waging against Israel since the 1990s. The Iran strategy against Israel since 1990 has been that Israel must be destroyed, but it's not Iran that should do it. The Iran strategy is to use proxies. This is, again, part of broader Iran strategy, to use proxies to defend Iran, to expand its regional interests. The Iran proxies, the Palestinians, other Arabs, other Muslims should bleed Israel, bring it to its knees, and force it to accept the Iranian peace plan, which would eliminate Israel peacefully as the state of the Jewish people. Part of this process, Iran supplied Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other organizations with the weapons, technology, know-how, money, training, etc. This is one phase, one process. Another process is that when Yahya Sinwar planned the attack against Israel, he had expected that he would be joined by at least 3 or 4 other partners. Hezbollah would join the battle immediately, Iran as well, the Palestinians in the West Bank, and it would be a popular revolt of the Arab citizens of Israel. These developments, fortunately, did not materialize. Now, the Iranians claimed, and I think partly true, that he did not consult with them about the exact date of the attack. Therefore, they were surprised and they had no intention of joining in. I think there is partial truth in it. He probably was afraid that he would spread the idea, it would somehow leak. But it was also an excuse for Iran not to fight Israel directly, because again, the Iran strategy is let others die for Iran. I always like to quote a Saudi journalist whose name I don't remember, that Iran is always happy to fight until the last drop of blood of the last Arab. Now, what has happened, however, is that Iran also unleashed other militias to fight against Israel, but in a limited way. Hezbollah had its own reasons not to open a full-scale war against Israel. Lebanon is in bad shape. Hezbollah does not want Lebanon to be destroyed in a full-scale war. The Iraqi militias played a part, and of course the Houthis in Yemen, partly allies, partly proxies of Iran. This development led to another escalation of Israel-Iran relations. Another escalation, and with this I'll finish, is that since 2017, Israel has been trying to block, partly successfully, Iranian deliveries of advanced weapons through Syria to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. In some of these attacks in the past, we killed Iranian officers. Apparently, the Iranians tried to retaliate once or twice, they failed. Apparently, what happened on April 1st, when Israel killed General Mousavi, there was a certain Israeli miscalculation. Either it was one killing too many, or the rank of the person, or the location, which the Iranians claimed was the consulate. Although I should say, no civilian employee was killed in this consulate. The only dead people are officers, so it's a very unique consulate. But maybe the Iranians regard it as their own territory. And this attack led Iran to change its policy, maybe to carry out a strategic shift and launch the attack against Israel.
What is the philosophical purpose for Iran to have this vast animosity against the state of Israel? What are those origins? What are those motivations?
In addition to traditional Shia anti-Judaism, which is worse than Sunni anti-Judaism, it is Ayatollah Khomeini who had inserted anti-Zionism, and I would also say anti-Semitism, into an integral part of his ideology. Khomeini and later Khamenei regards Zionism as the culmination of two wars against Islam. One is the all-Jewish war against Islam, which has started from the times of the Prophet Muhammad. In the first page of his important ideological book, The Rule of the Jews, he says that Islam was afflicted by the Jews from its inception. And the Jews had waged a war against the Prophet and against Islam ever since. The other war is the Western imperialist Jewish war against Islam, which goes back 1,000 years, in which the West and the Jews conspired against Islam and want to prevent Islam from fulfilling its historical mission. Zionism is the culmination of these two wars. Zionism is a Jewish Western instrument implanted artificially in the Middle East in order to subjugate, dominate, split, fragment the Muslims. Add to that the idea that Jews are not a people, therefore they do not deserve a state. The whole idea of Jewish sovereignty is an affront to Islam. It is a challenge to Islam. Therefore, a Jewish state is something which is unacceptable according to Islamic ideology. It is the greatest injustice in modern history according to Khamenei, and therefore Iran, being the flag carrier of the Muslim world or the leader of the Muslim world, must take the lead in eliminating Zionism and eliminating the Jewish state.
Let me fast forward. October 7th happens. Iran, which did not, it appears, know about the date of the attack, but obviously trained, armed, enabled Hamas to be what it is ultimately, as the White House has said, ultimately responsible. As the fighting continues and goes from weeks into months, Iran finds itself in a unique position. On the one hand, it's had tremendous success, not only in terms of inflicting upon Israel the worst calamity that Jews have suffered anywhere since the Holocaust, not only significantly undermining, in the moment at least, I don't believe writ large, but in the moment, the prospect of Saudi-Israel normalization, making itself very much part of the narrative again. Hamas will be able to say, should anything good come out of all of this? You see, it only happened because we had to kick the can. We had to shake the tree. PA couldn't do this. We had to do it. And then on top of that, Iran has its first successful implementation of the late Qasem Soleimani's concept of uniting the fronts. Any one front in the axis of resistance is attacked or suppressed, everybody will respond. I think they probably are just as surprised as we are that the most successful proxies in this round of fighting has not been Hezbollah, which has done daily things since October 8th, sure, but it's been Hamas on October 7th, and then the Houthis, disrupting international maritime trade in a huge way. And this has really proven a concept. And I think this is going to be, or they would like it to be, the new normal going forward, this uniting the fronts. On the flip side, this has been a huge setback for Iran because Iran's number one goal in the near term is to push the United States out of the region. The United States was beginning to take some very large steps out of the region, most recently withdrawing from a 2-decade-long deployment in Afghanistan, which you might say to me, Matt, that's outside the Middle East, but it's right on Iran's border. And now we're back. And we're back with a vengeance, and we're not going anywhere. And we saw that in terms of the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM coordinated air defense of Israel and, by the way, Palestinian territories and Jordan, etc., just a couple of weeks ago. And so Iran is balancing these two things. Then what has widely been reported in both American and Israeli press as basically a little bit of a miscalculation when Israel carried out the strike in early April, targeting this facility next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. Now, first of all, I call it a facility next to the Iranian embassy because it's become pretty clear since that this is not a consulate, that this was an apartment building situated in between the Iranian embassy and the Canadian embassy, which is empty right now. The Iranians had for some time been renting the top floor as a residence for diplomats, and then more recently renting a lower floor, but this was not any type of formal consulate. That's important because for Iran, the idea of sovereign territory, which a consulate or an embassy is, would be crossing a red line. And I wonder if that was something that they jumped on in part because it was a convenience, because I don't think that was the primary thing that drove them. When I look at this and I take a big step back, I look back actually to April, not of 2024, but April 1983, when Hezbollah blew up the US embassy in Beirut. And it appears got lucky in that they took out the entire CIA station and a bunch of visiting CIA officials, including Robert Ames, who was the chief Middle East analyst for the CIA at the time. I've never seen evidence that they knew that they were there, that they knew that the exact place that they chose to hit with the suicide car bomb was directly under the CIA station in the embassy. They ended up carrying out a strike that was more impactful than even they anticipated. And I think that's what happened in part with the Israeli strike, presumed Israeli strike on this facility next to the Iranian embassy, because you ended up having there 7 or 8 really important people. Now, there are a couple of other civilians who lived in the building, a woman and her son, who were killed, suggesting, by the way, that this was a civilian, not a diplomatic compound. But you had not only General Zahedi, who was responsible for all RGC Quds Force activity in the Levant, including Lebanon and targeting Israel, and his deputy, but you had a bunch of other RGC Quds Force officers. You had at least one senior Lebanese Hezbollah officer. And I think that this was probably the bigger issue for Iran, is that in one strike, one very, very targeted strike, and the more targeted these Israeli strikes, the kind of more uncomfortable Iran gets with Israeli capabilities, that they ended up killing so many people, so many important people. Now, there are a bunch of Israeli officials who've already commented off the record that they didn't expect that the response was going to be what it was. Maybe because they didn't see this as a consulate. Maybe because, as I'm suggesting, they didn't entirely know all the people who were going to be at this one meeting. In any event, Iran sitting in this position of, on the one hand, successfully uniting the fronts, and on the other hand, having a situation where it's drawn the United States back in, I think decided to push the envelope and to say, what happens if we demonstrate that we are really serious about preventing Israel from being able to carry out these types of attacks? And because of that, both Iran and Hezbollah have said from now on, Israel, you do things like this, we're going to do something right back. So a few days later, there was an Israeli airstrike that killed some Hezbollah guys in southern Lebanon, the type of thing that's been going on fairly regularly, not quite daily, but regularly since October 8th. And Hezbollah immediately fires back, this time intentionally hitting a location on the Israeli side of the border of the blue line that killed some soldiers and some civilians, very much a tit for tat. And so I think looking forward, this is what Israel and frankly the United States are going to want to be pushing back on. This idea that Iran and its proxies are within their rights to push back on any time Israel or the United States or someone else pushes back against them. Finally, I'll just say this, and this I think is very important. You'll hear lots of people saying, look, Israel took these escalatory steps. Israel ratcheted up. And I don't accept that. Israel is responding belatedly to the fact that Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah in particular, but others as well, have been ratcheting things up for a very long time. Meir, of course, is absolutely right. Iran's animus to Israel goes all the way back to the revolution, and they've been trying to undermine, in fact, destroy Israel through proxies through at least the early 1990s, at least. No question. But this has taken it to a whole new level. And I reject the idea that it's Israel that has escalated. Iran has escalated its presence in Syria. It's escalated what it's tried to do against Israel via its proxies from Lebanon, from Syria. I think people are forgetting that there have been incidents like Iran flying a drone from Syria south in Jordan along the Jordan River and then turning into Israel and hitting a school in Eilat. Iran is doing things more directly now than before. And finally, outside the scope of what we've been saying, I'll just kind of put a plug out there. We are about to launch at the Washington Institute an interactive map and timeline of Iran's external operations around the world, assassination plots, abduction plots, targeting Israelis, targeting Jews who are not Israelis but are just Jews, targeting Iranian dissidents and journalists, targeting Americans, trying to assassinate current and former senior U.S. government officials. This has been very, very much on the rise. And it is actually not unrelated to everything we're talking about, because my very last comment is Iran is still going to want to put more pressure on Israel than it has in the past. It understands now, after Israel struck back with a very, very precise and very limited strike of its own, but that showed what it could do, where it could hit, and what its intelligence capabilities were. I think Iran and its proxies are going to want to continue to hit. They're going to want to do it in ways that they think are reasonably deniable, which means to me that the likelihood that Iran or its proxies try and carry out acts of international terrorism, like the Hezbollah plot that was thwarted in Brazil a few weeks ago, like the fact that basically every Israeli embassy around the world is on high alert right now, is something we're going to need to pay a lot of attention to.
There's an irony, a bitter irony in the Iranians deciding that a violation of diplomatic immunity requires a massive Iranian response, given that they violated American immunity in Tehran. They have bombed the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992. Finally, by the way, the present Argentinian government under Milei indicted the Iranians for this act after years of, let's say, fairly problematic reactions from other Argentinian governments. The Iranians are not exactly the most famous for honoring the Vienna Convention. But beyond that, what we saw, I think, is part of a much larger story. What the Iranians were looking at right up to October 7 was an American and to some extent Israeli effort to consolidate the gains made in the Abraham Accords, and possibly, although I have my doubts how much this was really in the making, but it certainly at least looked as if Israeli-Saudi normalization is in the cards. Israeli government ministers visited Saudi Arabia. There were serious discussions between Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh about a package deal that would involve an American defense commitment to Saudi Arabia, things that the Iranians must have seen as essentially, once again, eroding the achievement of their sort of Chinese-sponsored relationship with the Saudis. All of this puts things in deeper context. Iran today is very much the smaller and most vulnerable part of a triangle of forces. Maybe if you add North Korea, it's the four horses of the apocalypse: China, Russia, Iran, and the cherubic young fellow in Pyongyang. Basically, the Iranians have positioned themselves as significant allies of the Russians well before the events of October 7 by providing them, among other things, with precisely the kind of weapons they have also tried to launch at us, the Shahed 136, etc. This is a strategic challenge not only to Israel. The strategic challenge to Israel is part and parcel of a much larger global picture. Iran is in this respect a part of a challenge not only to us. So it's befitting that the response on the 14th of April was largely Israeli, reliant on really remarkable achievements of Israeli technology. I think even the people who developed the Arrow systems and the David Sling and the various layers of the Israeli missile defense system did not expect such a spectacular result against a massive attack of that order. But at the same time, this was also the result of what some people call the Middle East Air Defense Treaty Organization. And it's a misleading name because it's not a treaty and there's no organization. It's an arrangement overseen, as you've heard already, by the US Central Command. It's the result of Israel's having been shifted from the European Command area of responsibility to the CENTCOM AOR back in 2021. It's a Trump decision implemented by Biden. And CENTCOM was in the Israeli Air Force Command Center for 2 days preceding the Iranian attack. So we have a level of coordination. I think I can say with a degree of certainty this was not just the Jordanians. There was at least one major Arab country with whom we do not have diplomatic relations directly involved in foiling this Iranian attack. So this certainly put the Iranians back. But the ultimate aspect of all of this, and we need not let this out of our minds for a minute, is the Iranian nuclear project. This is proceeding in a very dangerous direction. We've recently published in the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune an essay by Oli Heinonen, who used to be the chief inspector for the IAEA in Iran and suffered for his efforts, Iranian hostility even to the point of violence. And he clearly warns, and so does Rafael Grossi in open statements, that the Iranians are inching ever closer to having enough fissile material for a bomb. That would be, of course, a transformative moment, and all that we've seen must be weighed and analyzed against this background.
People are speaking to Iran about Iran, that the Iranian government will sometime in the next 6 months to a year and a half have the materials necessary to produce the weapon and also to send the weapon.
I think the threshold is, of course, a surge from around 60%, which they now enrich. By the way, putting the lie to the famous fatwa, allegedly, of Khamenei that they're not seeking a nuclear weapon, there's no purpose whatsoever for enriching to 60%, other than as a stepping stone to 94%, which is a weapon-grade level of uranium enrichment. That is a step that we hopefully would be able to detect. Given the level of intelligence that we've been able to bring to bear on their attack, they need to think twice before they take a step that would put them directly in harm's way. Maybe not only Israel, but others as well would feel obliged to act.
What you're suggesting is that Iran does have limitations.
I am suggesting that a firm position can have a deterrent effect. Years ago, I sat down to think about Iranian rationality, and I came across this concept of bounded rationality, of the ability to think very clearly and coherently and take the real world situation into account while you actually pursue completely demented purposes. This is not new. The little Austrian corporal was also quite a rational man in many ways who ultimately pursued an act of madness. There is something to that analysis when it comes to the Iranians. They are very careful and calculated in how they pursue an agenda which is ultimately an irrational one, or at least may have seemed irrational until they joined forces with Russia and China. Their conjunction with Russia and China makes the situation all the more dangerous. And we really need to focus, Israel needs to focus on the Iranian challenge above all. Having said so, destroying Hamas, with the Iranians unable to save them, is one important way for us to change the regional balance and destroy the project that they are trying to put together.
I find it difficult to appear as if I'm defending the Iranians, and I'm not defending them, but I have a slightly different perception than Iran. whom I value very much. First of all, I think the Iranians have enough material for a nuclear device if they want to experiment. The distance to a bomb is a bit longer because then you need the detonators and you need to build the nuclear warhead, which is not that simple. And apparently, as far as we know, the Iranians are not there yet. We are in a bad enough situation, but it's not yet that year. One thing. Secondly, regarding the so-called fatwa, I don't think it's a lie. Let me explain. I think that Khamenei is a vicious person, vehemently anti-Semitic, although he denies it. But Khamenei is a cautious person. And I think that Khamenei does not want a nuclear bomb for the time being because he's afraid of the regional repercussions. So there will be a nuclear race in the Middle East. Now, the way to pass a strategic decision in Iran is to do it by a fatwa. That is, you pass a religious ruling, which then gives the political decision greater weight. However, a fatwa is not eternal. Fatwa can be changed any day based on the circumstances. Having read some fatwas in the past, there are usually, as we say, the small print below, which often says, should it be absolutely necessary for the safety of the Islamic Republic, then nuclear bomb can be built. That is, I think the fatwa is genuine because if there was a political debate inside Iran, should Iran go all the way to the bomb, Khamenei, as the supreme leader, made a strategic decision not to go to a bomb yet. He packaged it as a fatwa, which means Iran is not there yet. I agree, by the way, Iran can be deterred. And I think, again, the Iranians are rational. Their aims are horrible. They're rational in the sense they're not a suicidal nation. They don't want Iran to be destroyed. By the way, this is one reason why they don't want a full-scale war against Israel. They don't want a nuclear war. Not that I belittle the danger of an Iranian nuclear bomb. In my view, first and foremost, aimed against what they perceive as an American threat. They are paranoid. They believe that the US is after them. Khamenei said something very important. He said, look at Gaddafi, the idiot. He had the nuclear option. He believed the Americans that if he would give up his nuclear option, he would be safe. Look where he ended. Crawling in a sewage pipe. Only an idiot would believe the Americans. So said Khamenei. He is scared. He is afraid of the Americans. He is paranoid about the Americans. He is certain that the US is adamant to destroy the Iranian government. And therefore, I think his nuclear bomb is first and foremost aimed against the US. That does not mean that should Iran get the nuclear bomb, it would not be a very bad development for the Middle East. That is, I fully agree we should do our utmost to prevent Iran from reaching a nuclear bomb. I don't think that military attack is the solution for it. It's a different story. But I would make a distinction here between, again, the repercussions of a bomb, the danger of a bomb, and the strategic decision at the time being in Iran regarding a bomb.
Eran, both you and Matthew referred to the unprecedented collaboration or coordination between a series of air forces, intelligence agencies, in pushing back on what happened April 13 and 14. Were those alliances of convenience, or do you think beneath it there is definitely a building alliance of conviction that will go further, regardless of who might be the next president of the United States?
I look at this as beyond the U.S.-Israel relationship, which, contrary to what you might read, is actually very, very, very strong. I look at this more in terms of the countries in the region and how they looked at events in this critical couple of days before the Iranian attack and then during the Iranian attack itself. Now, you recall that General Kirill, the head of Central Command, went to Israel and stayed there for several days. There is an element of self-interest here. These rockets are flying over Jordan. They're flying over Palestinian territories. You probably saw the pictures of rockets flying over the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. This image that Iran is firing rockets toward the third holiest site in Islam, and it's Israeli and American and Sunni forces that are protecting these places. But I do think it's more than that. I think that ultimately Hamas had other reasons for wanting to carry out October 7th. I think that ultimately Hamas really started putting in place a notional plan it had for a while to carry out what became October 7th 2 years earlier, right after the last Hamas rocket war in 2021. But I think that the precipitant event really was seeing the fact that the Abraham Accords were progressing faster and becoming more tangible than anybody thought. In particular, U.S. Emirati cooperation on two things. One, cyber, and two, air defense. I've been to 4 Gulf countries since October 7th and Israel. I know that other Gulf countries want in on that. They wanted in on this shared radar and missile defense long before the Iranian attack, because remember, there was, of course, the attack on Saudi Arabia at Arab Cake. There was, of course, the attack on the airport in the UAE. The UAE really wanted American air defense systems, which our system was too slow to provide in time. They got what they could from the French, which was better than nothing. Not bad, but not fantastic. Now the Emiratis have gotten stuff from Israel. Not everything Israel has, but more than they had. And I think that other countries, even before the events of April 2024, already wanted in on the system. This was proof of concept, coordinated by CENTCOM. I need people to understand, you've got hundreds of projectiles at different elevations, at completely different speeds. You've got ballistic missiles, you've got low altitude, slower missiles, you've got drones. And you want to make sure not only that you're tracking all this and hit, but you want to make sure everybody's not firing at the same one thing and then 10 other things get through. This is a very, very complicated system. I think it's clear to everybody who was involved directly and indirectly. And it is absolutely the case that Jordan was not the only Arab country that was an active participant in knocking these systems down. People want in on this, and to get in on this, what that means is getting in on the American and Israeli piggybacking on those capabilities and building out a regional defense system. No one's building out a regional defense system against Abkhazia or Japan. The threat in the region, perceived by everybody, is from Iran, not because of anybody being anti-Iran, or for that matter, even people being pro-Israel or anti-Palestinian or anything like that. It's just a reality. Iran has a history of fomenting militant activity in Sunni states. It has a recent history of shooting projectiles at some of those states and trying to foment instability. And you have the United States and Israel and moderate Arab states who are trying to figure out a way to protect themselves, not to present a threat to Iran or anybody else, but just to protect themselves. After this, people want in. It doesn't erase what's happening in Gaza. It doesn't erase the fact that there's a lot of uptight feelings about events since October 7th and what's going to be with the Palestinians and who's going to rebuild Gaza and all of that. All of that exists. But what people want is for there to be an answer to that so that we can get to this. I've seen today that in The Guardian in the UK, there's a story saying that the Saudi is concerned that there won't be a near-term solution to Gaza and unwilling to go ahead with a big normalization, a trilateral Saudi-Israel U.S. normalization plan without progress in Gaza, are pushing a plan B that leaves Israel out for the moment. That has sub-zero chance of getting anywhere. It's not even a matter of conversation. So we're talking about a big push still today to try and do something that would be completely changing this region for the good in a significant way. That doesn't mean it's going to happen or it'll be easy, but I understand why the Iranians are concerned that they might have stepped a little bit too far and helped unite a bunch of countries that are not necessarily always natural allies.
I don't want to make analogies to the 50s and the Baghdad Pact.
But I will.
But I will. The point is, when you have a common external threat that's undermining the national security or the well-being of specific number of countries who otherwise don't want to sleep together, they find ways to find a bed and to pull the cover over them and still act in a collaborative way because they know it's in their national interest to do so. That seems to be the bottom line.
I completely agree that this trial balloon in The Guardian is sheer fantasy, and I think Senator Graham has already spoken to that. If the Americans are expected to basically go into a binding arrangement with the Saudis, that would require a Senate 67 majority, no chance whatsoever of any of this happening without an Israeli dimension. Going back to the larger question, at the end of the day, what matters to us now is not the formal relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's not the overall package. It's the ability to act decisively against Iran if the need arises. Will the Iranians use the bomb against us if they have it? Well, I can see many rational reasons why they would be very careful, even if they do have the capacity. In their minds, regardless of whether it's true or not, on which I can say nothing, we have a capability not only of striking them, but of a second strike, given what they perceived as the relevant Israeli platforms. Beyond that, the consequences of this action may be disastrous. If they look at what happened to them on April 14, they launched, they failed, and they would be punished as if they succeeded, if they try something more significant than the attack this time. So the calculus, the rational calculus points against it. However, in their mind, what should happen is for Israel to crumble internally, living under this constant threat of annihilation by a nuclear-capable Iran. And with the Iranian nuclear umbrella sort of providing cover for the incessant activity of their proxies against Israel, this in itself makes the proposition untenable from an Israeli point of view. And not only from an Israeli point of view, because to just take what Meir said about Iranian rationale against Israel one step further, it's not just the hatred of Israel as an idea, as a Western project. It is also for Iran their way of saying we should lead the region, not the Arab world, they're not Arabs, but the region, the Muslim world, because we are going to remain in the business of destroying Israel when all these Sunni traitors have fallen by the wayside from Egypt. Remember that there is a street, Meir, correct me if I'm wrong, a street in Tehran named after the assassin of Sadat, Islambuli. Of course, the Emiratis, the Saudis who are under the covers, or as I used to say, in the most crowded place in the Middle East, under the table, have been doing business with Israel for years, certainly defense business. And all of these traitors should be pushed aside. And this would constitute the ultimate vindication of the Shia versus the Sunni way in Islam. I think Israel is both a purpose and an instrument in the larger Iranian scheme. And therefore, I totally agree with Matthew. We have a common interest, an existential common interest, with the Sunni regimes of much of the region, insofar as at the end of the day, Iran is not a threat to us alone. From time to time, we make comparisons with the Nazis, but the one who did it most explicitly in recent years was Mohammed bin Salman, who basically, at some point, compared Iran to the Nazis. Then, in order to needle the Biden administration, he was willing to play a game via China with the Iranians, but that was, I think, a tactical rather than a strategic consideration. Ultimately, hinges on our ability to act effectively against Iran.
First of all, I fully agree with what Eran and Matthew said. I want to add one point. The Iranians are rational, but former President Rafsanjani, a moderate, a pragmatist, and a very rational man, businessman, by the way, greatest pistachio merchant in Iran, said many years ago that rationally, one bomb can finish Israel. Iran and the Muslim world are much larger, therefore they can sustain first strike and second strike. This is a rational argument. Nuclear weapons can destroy Israel, we can survive nuclear war. This is a rational argument. Then there's another problem. There was a president in Iran, true, he was not the person who made this decision, but he made a lot of noise. But we can have a person like this, Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad had messianic beliefs. He believed, and his supporters issued a very horrifying short clip, that the day of the Messiah is near. They visioned an apocalypse, which would bring the Shia Messiah, the Mahdi. Now, Ahmadinejad, for the time being, is not powerful. But we cannot never exclude the possibility that after Khamenei's death, we will have a person who may have messianic tendencies, inclinations.
I think it's pretty easy for people living outside Israel to say, look, it's likely that if Iran were to have the bomb, they would be rational not use it. I don't know that people in the region, in particular Israel, have the comfort level to be able to do that. Iran has demonstrated proclivity for doing things that we in the West would not consider to be fully rational. It is rational from their perspective. It's a different type of rationality because they're willing to assume more risk and to assume more risk for things that will yield less guaranteed dividends, whereas we in the West are more risk averse. And when we act, it's only when we really think we're going to get something done. And so at the end of the day, We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able, and this has been, I think, one of the key problems with the JCPOA, the Iran deal, the sunset clauses and nuclear specific things aside, we allowed Iran to dictate and limit the deal to what they wanted it to cover, which is the nuclear issue only, while letting them believe that they would get all the benefits of stopping all of their malign activities. And I think it's now quite clear that we have to be able to deal with all of the activities that are destabilizing. That has to include now, in the moment when we're dealing with Iran being so aggressive in the region, we cannot forget about the nuclear file. And in all those other times, a few years ago, and probably in months to come, when we're very, very focused on the nuclear file, we can't stop thinking about their malign activities in the region, their external operations, etc. Because Iran is doing all these things at the same time. They're not the ones who are only paying attention to one of these shiny objects at a time. We are. They're doing all of these at the same time.
Somehow, foreign policy and expectations of your enemy have got to take into account three items: rationality, ideology, and the leadership ego that changes from time to time, from person to person, and from organization to organization. And to somehow come up with a template that is capable of predictability, I'm not sure AI could do that, particularly when you deal with an area like the Middle East that has always surprised us. And when we turn our back to it, it just seems to come up and bite us in the hindmost. It was a fascinating April for any of us who follow events in the Middle East, follow Israel, follow the United States, follow the hope for continued political stability in the region. We'll be back again, I'm certain, to discuss all of this. And I hope with the three of you, you've been gracious with your time and with your insights. If you benefited from what you heard today, and if you want more, let us ask you, please, to go to our donate page and support the Center for Israel Education. We're only interested in providing information. We don't do disinformation. And as you can tell from the three gentlemen here today, it is the highest level of information that we can possibly provide.